questions that we might have. So with that, thank you, Kit, and I'll pass on to you.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I want to also, besides being a master garden, I've spent the last 40 years of my career as a landscape architect in the area. So I come with a heavy background in all things related to landscaping, but ever since becoming a master gardener, I've really put my heart and soul into the underlying aspects, such as soils. It's one of the first presentations I think I ever prepared for master gardeners. So it's an ongoing, always learning process. And so here we go. Oh, and I'm going to ask that if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please type them into the chat box. And then when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll go through those and answer them. So I am calling this presentation Turning Dirt into Gold, so that you can learn to understand how the soil food web works and making it work for you. And our agenda is going to cover sustainability in the home garden, the mechanical aspects of soil. We'll cover I'll describe what the soil food web is and how you can make that work for you, what soil improvements you should attempt to do, what will give you the biggest bang for your buck, and then we will have a question and answer wrap up at the end. So as gardeners, everything we do starts with the soil. And obviously the role of soil is to actually provide a medium for plants to grow in. And as plants grow and lose their leaves and die back, all of that organic matter and what we call waste returns to the soil, and it's part of what builds soil. And it's just a continuous cycle. There's a lot of functions that soil provides to us besides just for gardening. It's got all these different components of cultural heritage. Carbon sequestration is a big one, and we're hearing that a lot about that these days with regard to climate change and how we can actually do our part to reduce the amount of carbon that's being released into the air. We can do that through our gardening practices. And the nutrient cycling, we'll be talking about that. It provides habitat for organisms, and it's where we grow food. So the process of soil formation starts with parent material, which is generally rocks and just general minerals. And when that's in, until it's gone by climate, it's affected by topography. That's why there's lots of nice silty loam down in the valley, because as soil or rock is eroded and turned into finer materials, our rivers and streams move it downhill and deposit it. That's why the farming is such a bigger thing in the valley. And then soil organisms play a huge part in the process of soil formation, and all of this takes time. So when we look at soil, and because it's deposited and it started out with your basic rock material, there are horizons and profiles. I'm not going to get too much into this, but I think this graphic shows you that what we're particularly interested in is the top 3 layers at the most, but we're really interested in our topsoil because that's what we grow. That's what the plants, for the most part, grow in, and that's where they get their nutrients. So soil is, like I mentioned, is partly the mineral weathered rock. That's the component we call dirt. And it's what helps provide the dust in our homes, unfortunately, but it's what it is. And then hopefully roughly 50% of good soil is composed of air and water. And that's where roots have the room to grow. And then in a really good soil, we can find roughly 5% organic matter. Here in the foothills, we're lucky to get 1 to 2%. And a lot of that has to do with interference of the natural processes. On our own lands, oftentimes people rake or blow away the leaves rather than let them return to the soil, reducing the amount of organic matter that the soil would naturally have if it was just left alone. So air and water is what fills those voids in between the mineral particles. And generally it moves 2 ways through the soil. It moves gravitationally, which is just pulling down where water seeps into the ground freely. And then by capillary action, things are just pulled through the molecular attraction of water molecules for each other, and by ions of other minerals in the soil as well. And that water movement is also what helps push and get rid of stale air in the soil and provide new air in the soil. So when you have compacted soils, those air and pathways get smaller, and therefore roots are more impeded by that. So water movement pushes out the stale air and pulls in the fresh air, displacing carbon dioxide. And soil, like I said, soil compaction actually reduces that pore space and then inhibits the ability of plant roots and soil organisms to do their magic in the soil. So it's something that you really want to avoid, is compaction of your own soil. And then hydroscopic waters, there's always a tiny amount of water that is not accessible to plant roots. It's just adhered so tightly by soil molecules or the minerals that it can't be used, but it's always there. But that is critical to bacteria and other organisms actually use that hydroscopic water to move in the soil. So our soils are based on particle size. A lot of us in the foothills are always talking about having clay soils, and that's not necessarily the case. A lot of people are mistaken about their soil structure and what type they actually have. But clay particles themselves are actually invisible. You cannot see them without a microscope. Slightly larger are silt molecules, and that would be like a pinpoint size, somewhere in that range, going up to sands and then gravels. You can see the relative size here of what those soils are. And here is a magnification of actually some of the particles that if you were to actually put your soil under a microscope, what you might see. It's microscopic or pretty much, I mean, you'd never see this without a microscope. Microscopic particles of all different kinds of minerals, depending on what your parent soils are. So that is your soil texture. Silt, sand, clay are the 3 primary ones, but how they are arranged is called your soil structure. And what we aim for, and you can have any of these based on pretty much how much organic matter is in your soil will influence which you have of these. But what we really aim for is, for gardeners, what we prefer is the granular soil structure, because it makes it so much easier to work in terms of getting anything in the ground. And then it's what is best for plants. It's where they are the healthiest, when they have lots of room to move between the soil particles. So the arrangement, your soil structure affects your drainage. It affects the air circulation, which is very important to the health of plants, and the space for soil organisms to live. So good soil structure, as the picture shows, is nice and granular. It's very workable. It resists erosion. It resists drying, and it maintains the nutrients in the soil. And we'll show you, I'll be talking about why that is. Whereas poor soil structure is very much the opposite. Oftentimes, if you have bad soil structure, you'll find it gets hard as a rock during the summer. It's very difficult to work. You can't get a shovel into it. And so oftentimes our response to that is to overwater and over-fertilize. So again, the arrangement of your soil structure affects your drainage, affects that air circulation. And we're going to talk about making space for soil, promoting soil organisms. I covered that. So one of the things you can do, if you don't know what your soils are composed of, you can do a jar test at home. And I'm not going to cover all this here. You'll have access to copies of this because it's being recorded. You can go back and you can go online and Google jar test and get a number of recommendations on how to do that. It's relatively easy. So what you end up doing is just put a little soil into a jar, shake it up with a little soap, and then let it settle out. And then you will come up with these different layers, which then you have to measure with a ruler, and you can figure out what percentages of sand, silt, and clay you have. The easiest way to find out what you most likely have is go to the NRCS website. That's the National Resource Conservation Service. And this is a map of my home. And you can see, and hopefully you can see my cursor moving here. I actually have 3 different types of soil on my property, but it will tell you what those are. In this case, I've got a very rocky, silty loam and more silty loam, and my soils test proves that out when I did it, the jar test at home. So that just informs me it'll inform a lot about not necessarily what you add to the soils, but it really informs your irrigation. And that's very important to healthy plants as well. So what we're looking for, if we're wanting to improve our soil, and most of us are, is to get a soil that is tilthy. It's got that balance of that granular composition, the granular structure. It has really good drainage, but it also holds water well. So it's got a nice balance. Around here, we really want soils that will hang on to water during the summer in particular, so that we don't need to be irrigating as much. It's very important, though, that your soils drain well, and that can be a function of a lot of different things in your soil, in your geographic area. So just testing that, or you may know already, just if you're an avid gardener, you already know whether or not you've got standing water or water runs off very quickly. But this is it. It doesn't hurt that if you don't know, just to dig a hole, fill it, and see how long it takes to drain. Because what that will do is inform you where not to put plants that really cannot tolerate standing water or slow drainage, because that in itself causes a lot of problems as well in terms of disease or poor soil growth. So the other aspect of soils, looking at soils, is the soil color. Now I know my soils are kind of in this range without any improvement, without any organic matter added. My soils were kind of in this range. I'm kind of probably in this range now. The darker browns were somewhere in here. This nice chocolatey espresso color is the epitome of really good soil. It's an indicator that you have a lot of organic matter in your soil. So adding, for any of those who have been adding compost and manures, etc., you will have noticed how your soils have changed over the years. I know mine have, and I'm thrilled to get to that point. So that's usually a good indicator of lots of organic matter. That soil color is influenced by the parent material, so don't worry too much about that. And then, like I mentioned, organics are what bring that really dark color. Gray indicates a lack of organic matter, or it can be that there's actually anaerobic conditions going on in the soil. You'll see that further down the hill and in flatter areas where the clay particles will end up consolidating at a layer in the soil, and oftentimes that layer will be gray, depending on what the parent material was. And orange to red soil indicates the presence of oxidized iron. So no worries there. It is pretty much a good indicator of clay soils. They tend to be the ones that around here that are red and orange. Oftentimes you will hear a lot of talk about doing soils tests. Soil test traditionally is testing for nitrogen, potassium, and NPK and phosphorus, excuse me. And but those tests do not measure plant available nutrients. They're only measuring what's there in the soil. And if they're not in a form where a plant can take them up, it really doesn't matter much. And we'll talk more later about the use of chemical fertilizers and the damage they actually do. So your soil chemistry changes throughout the year because it's very much, as chemicals are, dependent on temperatures. And two, you won't get the same results from lab to lab to lab. So those results, although they may tell you something, and oftentimes they will be more precise about your soil structure, the actual results you get in terms of nutrients aren't really usable. Soil pH, though, is very, may be very important, especially if you're having issues with your plants. If they're showing chlorotic conditions, one of the things you may want to do is to test your soil's pH to see where it is. Soil pH hugely influences the availability of nutrient uptake by the plants. As you can see from this chart, you pretty much want to be in the middle there, somewhere between 6 and 7.5 is a really happy place for plants. They're able to access all of these various nutrients in the soil. When you get off to one side or the other, that availability shuts down because it influences the chemical bonding of those nutrients. So typically, and this especially used to be true 20 years ago, the typical gardening approach: rototill, fertilize, water, water, water. If it looks dry, water it, or if it looks yellow, water it. Rake away, toss, burn the leaves, and then the use of herbicides and insecticides. Very much, unfortunately, a traditional part of the gardening processes, hopefully mostly in the past. And oftentimes, most gardeners really do rely on a blend of old wives' tales. Boy, do we see that flying around on Facebook if you are on many of the gardening sites. And then anecdotal science, especially say in the use of Epsom salts, those kinds of things. It's a good idea to kind of really go in and check on the validity of some of these things. And then, the sales pitches. So really watch out when it's coming from a manufacturer. So the old approach really wasn't based on science. It was based on looking at the physical structure and the chemistry of the soil. The new approach is really focused more on the biology of the soil. And this, because it allows the organisms to do their work, and it really will help you become a better gardener. When you understand this, you're going to look at your soils a whole different way. The soil food web is all about cultivating soil to help plants grow much better. And gardening with the soil food web actually helps us reconnect with the natural processes as nature does in building the soil. So it can actually result in, after you've done the work to build your soils up, it will really reduce your work later on. So there's really a benefit to you in doing that. As we're all aware, photosynthesis is the most basic process that fuels life on this planet. And it really is a very, I mean, when you think about it, it's really a very magical process of converting sun energy to all the plant material we see on this planet, providing us food and all other kinds of benefits. So plants in turn, once they've processed and photosynthesized light, they produce carbohydrates, which then in turn are put out into the roots. It feeds itself, the plant feeds itself with these carbohydrates, but a lot of these carbohydrates are sent down and shared with soil organisms and stored in the soil in the form of carbohydrates, which is carbon-based. So when we talk about carbon sequestration, that's what plants do naturally. They sequester carbon in the soil and share them with soil organisms. And those are called exudates. Elaine Ingham calls them cakes and cookies with in terms of how soil organisms view these. They're going after things that actually benefit them and that they need to live as well. So in a healthy soils, healthy plants will get roughly 85 to 90% of the nutrients that they need through this carbon exchange of these exudates. So the soil food web involves a whole array of soil organisms, from bacteria and fungi at the very base of the food chain in the soil, which then in turn feed nematodes, arthropods, eventually the worms and larger arthropods, and then in turn, those insects provide food sources for animals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish, etc. So again, this soil food web is really key to a healthy ecosystem. Those very first organisms, the bacteria and the fungi, are decomposers, and they break down the plant material that falls on the soil and incorporate it, gets brought down and incorporated into the soil, and then this whole array of other organisms deal with it and feed those nutrients back to plants. So you can see here, it even gets more complex. This is the level we can actually see as gardeners out in the soil. The bacteria, and sometimes you can see the mycelium from fungi. They're very hard to see, but when there's enough of them, those white fine hairs we can see. But they are out there, and they provide, the bacteria and fungi are the basis for the food web for these particular organisms. So this kind of gives you a better picture of the how it works when you're seeing it. All these organisms, the trees are there putting out their roots, or the plants. They're sending out the exudates. Everything else is then building and feeding on that. 1 teaspoon of healthy soils can contain 1 million to 1 billion bacteria, miles of fungi, of fungal hyphae, and just tons of other organisms. It's really mind-boggling to think about. But the benefits of having those organisms in your soil is that they do eliminate the needs for pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, and fungicides. And they will improve your water quality and your air holding capacity. As they move around, as all these organisms move through the soil, they provide more pathways, not only for themselves, but roots as well, and for fungi. So again, this is another great diagram that kind of emphasizes how all that works. They're all working in partnership with each other. So soil organisms, the basic thing that they do is decompose organic matter, plant residues, leaves, twigs, etc. All that eventually breaks down, and the manures. If they didn't, we would just be, who knows how deep, in residues that fall. And in doing so, they sequester nitrogen and other nutrients because they take it up. This is turned into their own, just like we eat, our food is delivered through our bodies. It helps our our organs function. Same thing with bacteria and fungi and all those other organisms. So to a certain extent, when everything eats, including us, we sequester parts of those nutrients in our own bodies until we aren't here any longer. And when an organism gets eaten by another organism, it's just part of the cycle of cycling nutrients. They fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. They enhance the soil aggregation and porosity. And they also help prey on pests. Both fungi and beneficial nematodes are a great example of keeping other soils, bad fungi, under control. So it's all about getting balance so that disease-causing fungi and disease-causing organisms are kept, if they're kept in control in terms of population, they're always there, but they don't cause a problem. It's when things get out of balance that all of a sudden those like anthracnose and some of the other fungi can get out of control, and then they start killing your trees off. So the benefit of soil fertility is its capacity to nurture healthy soils. The microorganisms, as I mentioned, are nutrient facilitators. If you think of them that way, I think it really kind of helps put them in a good light, that it makes it easily understandable. And they're responsible for the formation of humus through their decomposition process. And this all really happens through what we call the poop loop. So all these organisms, while they're taking in nutrients themselves and carbohydrates and eating each other, it always results going in one end and out the other. But even all of that is consumed or broken down by something else. So there's this constant loop. And so then you even add animals' excrement from that. And I know probably many of you, like me, I put my chicken poop into my compost bins, and to help enrich that. It can actually really help with the, to elevate the nutrient value of the compost that you're making. So there's this constant cycle going on. So there are two main pools of carbon: the organic, which we see, leaves falling, everything else, everything living that dies and then gets recycled, and then the inorganic carbon. And that really does not provide any benefit. It's just there as a medium. So we've got good bacteria, and then when things get mucky, it's usually and often related to the presence of anaerobic bacteria, and that's because there's not enough air to keep the regular aerobic bacteria and other organisms in a healthy condition. So when soil gets too compact or things become too wet, you will get an issue with anaerobic bacteria, and that can happen in your compost piles too if they don't get turned frequently enough and if they're too wet. And E. coli and Clostridium are examples of anaerobic bacteria. As I mentioned, that the healthy soil food web really helps control disease, because not all soil organisms are beneficial, but having having healthy populations keeps those non-beneficial organisms in check. And here's an example kind of that nutrient cycle and the role of soils in it. All these soils organisms really help keep the nutrients moving, and particularly the nitrogen, which all plants need, but they don't need it in the quantities that commercial fertilizers provide. And actually that just throws everything off. So there are other plants that have nitrogen fixing bacteria, especially the legume family. Peas and lupins, etc., have little nodules on them that help fix bacteria in the soil. And then that is made available to plants. Decomposers such as bacteria and fungi also have a role, and nitrifying bacteria. So all of this works together to provide plants what they need. And plants they have signals that they work with all these organisms to kind of tell them what they need to trade for those carbohydrates. So bacteria are the chemosynthesizers, and they are the primary decomposers in the soil. And they work, you'll usually find the highest concentrations of them right in the vicinity of the roots and on the surfaces of organic matter. That's what OM means, organic matter. But they have to be in the presence of oxygen to be healthy, and they will help control the pathogenic bacteria. They do play a very important role in breaking down toxins and pollutants. And one of the things they're finding out now is that certain types of bacteria can actually be beneficial and play a role in breaking down like oil for oil spills and that. But they also help play a role in helping break down and reassimilate toxins in the soil. Now, don't take that as something that you can go helter-skelter and play with in terms of insecticides, pesticides, etc., because it does impact the populations. But eventually, with time, bacteria can be very important in helping restore areas and restore soil health. This is mentioning the importance of pH in the soil. It also greatly affects the health and quality of bacteria in the soil. Because again, when things get too acidic or too basic, that can impede the actions and the jobs of bacteria. The slime that's exuded from bacteria, I mentioned that they kind of move through this hygroscopic layer of water on minerals in the soil that can't be released, and it's not available to roots. But they also provide a biofilm that they actually kind of mixes with that water. And it's one of the things that's very important in holding soil particles together so that they're less prone to erosion. And then there's our friends, the fungi. There's a whole array of fungi in the soil, as you can see from this. And of particular importance is the Mychorrhizae. Fungi are the primary decay agents. They are on everything already for the most part, out there on our leaves and the twigs and etc. They're in the soil, and they start as soon as that plant, as soon as a leaf drops, those really start to go to work on breaking down the lignins and cellulose, which are the most resistant to decay, because otherwise they would be just dripping off the trees. The chitin shells of insects and the bones of animals all get worked on and broken down by fungi. So it plays a very important role. They are decomposers. They cycle nutrients. There are thousands of varieties of fungi. It's not just one. They are soil, they help build the soil. They really have a symbiotic relationship with plant roots and plants. And I don't have enough time to even go talk about that part of it. It's really fascinating. And they do help prevent or can cause diseases when they get out of balance. So what we see, the fungi, the mycorrhizae in the soil, get to a point where they need to reproduce, so they send up the mushroom bodies. They're just, and then those emit their spores, and on the process goes. So that's how fungi reproduce. But otherwise, you mostly don't see them through, unless those bodies are there, you don't see them. So this is what mycorrhizae kind of look like under a microscope. Just very fine hairs. They're cells end to end in the soil that just make their way. They tremendously increase the root zone of a plant by the fact that they attach, and then they go out and bring back nutrients and water and other things that plants need. They extend that root zone capability. It makes you, this is part of the process, I believe, why our natives can survive in the dry soils that we have through the summertime, is because all of this is going on underground and providing plants what they need. Otherwise, you would see them going dormant, much like we see buckeye going dormant in the end of July, mid-July oftentimes. That would not be a pretty environment to live in. So the fungus grows in association with the roots because they attach either to the outside of the roots or actually grow in and trade nutrients inside the plant cells themselves and move nutrients and water. 90 to 95% of plants have these associations with mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae are just exceptionally important to soil health and to the health of plants. They convert insoluble nutrients into the plant available forms that then plants easily take in and process, especially phosphorus. That mycorrhizae are absolutely required for plants to process or to access phosphorus and process it. And they exchange this for the exudates, the carbohydrates that the plants are sending down as through the process of photosynthesis. And then their waste provides the nitrogen that plants need. So this is a good example of what I talked about in terms of mycorrhizae. Often, some mycorrhizae attaches to the outside to do their work, and some of it actually is inside the plant root itself in terms of these exchanges. This is something that has developed through the processes of oops, my brain dead, sorry. These processes have established and taken a long millions of years to develop with plants. And microfungi were some of the first organisms that we know, on this planet. So they form the symbiotic relationship and convert insoluble nutrients that make them available to plants in particular. So another good illustration of seeing how, you know, the untrained eye might think these are plant roots, but oftentimes those little hairs that you can see are actually the fungi that you're seeing. So again, they unlock and transport minerals that are needed by plants. And then we've got our slime molds. I don't know, I remember the first time I ever saw one out in a mulch pile, I was like, oh my God, what is that? And we came back and looked it up, and it's called dog barf slime, I think it's what it's called. And it's like, oh, dog vomit slime. That's it, dog vomit slime molds. And they really do change. They start out just looking like a mass, and eventually they turn this sulfur yellow, and then they go brown again. And if you touch them, they kind of explode and go poof. So, and there's nothing wrong with those. Those are a good indicator of life in your mulch piles. Let them alone. They're not harmful. They're actually beneficial. So just let them be. And then we've got our protozoa or threadworms. These are another, I'm going to kind of go quickly through this, but there's all kinds of, this is more just to show you what the variety of soil organisms are. So again, they play a key role in helping cycle nutrients and providing them to the plants. And going back, I don't know if I can go back, protozoa and some of those others are what our earthworms feed on. So it's important that they are in the soil if you want to have a healthy earthworm population. Nematodes, which are non-segmented roundworms, they're not worms at all. We use that term to describe long, thin organisms, but they are, and they're almost not visible to the naked eye. Most are not, and they require very porous soil. But beneficial nematodes actually keep root nematodes, which are damaging, under control. And then you've got all the other arthropods that like I mentioned, we can see those and we know what they are, and they're very important. None of these organisms that you see here, well, some of them, the snails and slugs can be moderately damaging, depending on what they're damaging, if they get out of control. But a lot of these other organisms will actually feed on them. But all of them do add to the poop loop, and they help shred and break up a lot of the plant material that falls so that it gets assimilated down into the soil quicker. So they all have their jobs. The difference is microarthropods require a microscope to see, and macroarthropods are visible with the naked eye or a hand lens. Soil mites are another soil organism we see, and they're an indicator of soil health, so don't get freaked out when you see these. You can see how small these springtails are. Again, they're a favorite food of mites. So, you know, you see one, oftentimes people just think if they've got organisms like this in the soil that there's a problem with it, and there's not. These are very beneficial. Termites and ants, you know, unless they're in your home, they are super beneficial for the soil health itself, because they help break down cellulose in the soil. And again, the process of fungi and other organisms then take it even further and gets assimilated and dispersed, and plants take it up, etc. But the tunnels that ants and termites use actually help break up the soil even more, and making more room for water and air and roots themselves. So I know one of the things that a lot of people are always concerned about ants. If they're not coming into your home, don't be worried about them. If the termites are out in the piles of wood out on your property, don't be worried about them. Where you need to worry about them is if you've got tubes coming up the side of your foundation, that's when to worry about them. Now, earthworms in particular, we're all pretty much, I think, are aware that earthworms are beneficial. They're master shredders. They help increase porosity of the soil. Their poop loop is super beneficial for the soil. Buying worm castings is one good way to actually just give your soil a big oomph and getting, because where you put them, you will get more earthworms for sure. I've seen this as I've improved my own soils on my own property. They greatly increase the microbe population in the soil and increasing the soil fertility. And as I mentioned, the vermicastings is what we call worm poop. And soils that have worms in them generally have 50% higher organic matter than soils that do not have worms. It's because the worms are able to take in that organic matter and then disperse it through the soil through their digestive process. Soils that have a healthy earthworm population, you can see all the benefits. They've got richer phosphate, potash, nitrogen availability, and magnesium and calcium. So lots and lots of benefits to having earthworms. And then humus is the point at which organic matter becomes unidentifiable. You just can't tell what it was before, but you know it's organic matter. It's not mineral. So it's rich in bacteria and fungi and really boosts your soil fertility. So just to kind of summarize this aspect about the soil food web, it helps control disease because not all soil organisms are beneficial, but the good ones help keep the problem ones under control. It eliminates the need for fertilizers because that's what all these organisms in concert with plants are doing, is cycling it back to the plants. We'll talk about why it reduces the need for pesticides, and part of that is because a healthy plant generally is not attractive to pests, and so therefore reduces the need for pesticides. Same thing with herbicides. And then fungicides as well. Now, there are some fruit trees that perhaps, depending on what you've got, leaf peach curl can be an issue. I'll talk a little bit more about a strategy for if you need to use fungicides. We'll talk about what needs to be done. But again, it improves water and air holding capacity and just healthier plants. So those bacteria and fungi and all the other soil organisms really help bind your soil particles together so it doesn't wash away. And again, and physically, the fungal hyphae actually help bind particles together through those fine hairs that hold on to it. So this is a good visual. Bacteria and fungi are equivalent to a good fertilizer. Protozoas and nematodes are the fertilizer spreaders. Now, there is a difference between what various plants prefer in a soil. Trees, shrubs, and perennials, woody plant materials prefer fungal-dominated soils. It's that relationship with woody plants that really boosts fungi in the soil, whereas vegetables, veggies, annuals, and grasses prefer bacteria-dominated soils. So what that means is you don't necessarily want to be, you want to use compost, but you don't necessarily want to be doing it with a woody-based material. But they'll find their way through it. As long as the soil is rich in organic matter, they'll work it out. And this is really interesting because one of the things is we know certain plants like blueberries or rhododendrons, azaleas, etc., prefer acidic soils. Others prefer alkaline soils. But believe it or not, plants have the ability to control their own pH through these root relationships that they have with the soil organisms, they are able to control the pH, and so that they can grow. And it may be just in the immediate area, and it won't be all over, but they are able to do that. So if they don't get a lot of interference with people adding stuff to the soil, they'll work it out. So all dung is recycled into nutrients. Our feet spread microbes, our feet and the feet of animals, and then birds themselves indicate that all of these arthropods, worms, and larvae are present, and other insects as well. I know right now the juncos are feeding out in the soil, and I see them kicking up the leaves and trying to think of the other birds that are out there. But anyway, the towies and lots of others. And I see the bluebirds out in the field as well, kind of diving for insects. But all of these animals actually help spread the bacteria and fungi in the soil as well when they move it around for their food sources. So the reason you don't want to be using chemical fertilizers is because they really reduce the population of all these organisms that are part of the soil food web. It slows the production of exudates that are being shared into soil, and halts or slows down the formation of humus formation, because you don't have the soil organisms doing the work for you. As those microbe populations decline, so do the populations of bacteria and fungi, and worms are irritated by chemical fertilizers as well. In addition to that, chemical fertilizer, and so it's by those very actions, by the fact that you lose the populations of soil organisms, that soil structure starts to deteriorate, because you don't have all of those, the slime goos and the poop loop working to hold soil particles together. And it increases, fertilizers are salts. So when those are put into the soil, they either leach out, or a lot of the salts stay behind and greatly affect water uptake and a lot of other processes going on in the soil, which then increases pathogens and pests. Not only that, fertilizers, because of the nitrogen they have, really boost the new growth that is very tasty to other critters like deer. So here you have this unnatural, like candy to predators or browsers, that then it actually attracts them, and that's something you don't want to have happen. I've noticed, because I've gardening mostly with natives, other than my edible garden, I don't, what you don't have is this huge flush of new leaves that then require lots of pruning. So there's lots of downsides to using chemical fertilizers. Rototilling is something that really damages the soil. Now, I do it once. I do it once because I have just actually put in the majority of my garden at this home this last year. You do it once to incorporate tons of organic matter and get it worked into the soil, because the benefits of doing that in the long run are going to be absolutely amazing. But you don't want to continue to do it. You don't want to continue to hoe and stir up your soil, even for vegetable beds, because it breaks up and destroys a lot of your organisms. They all kind of have little roles and niches in the soil. And once you mix that up, it takes a while to reestablish that. It will happen, but it takes a couple of years for that kind of to all work out. It ends up breaking up your soil structure and actually eventually reducing the air and water holding capacity of your soil. So it's rototilling time and time again, even to add more and more mulch. Once you've done it once, then just simply laying your compost on top of the ground, the organisms will do the work for you of incorporating it down into the soil. So soil decline is a reinforcing loop that it can be catastrophic if you continue to remove the organic matter from the soil, like raking away your leaves or never applying compost, depending on what you're growing. You know, if we live in a rather, gardening for the most part is a rather artificial, unless you've got a native garden where you let things be. Most of our gardens are somewhat artificial in terms of natural processes. So helping it along and build your soil and keep it healthy is beneficial. This is a really, really good book, and this is something, Diana, for your book club. Soul of the Soil is a fabulous book. So the proper care and feeding of soil organisms demands close attention to managing those soil organisms. And so your first priority to restore or build a diverse soil food web involves building and maintaining that humus in the form of compost, and then even putting mulch over the soil actually helps with that, because the layer closest to the soil constantly gets incorporated over time. That's why we need to replace our mulches over time. So no matter what soil you have, whether it's clay, silt, sand, anything in between, loams, will improve it'll improve the availability of soil food web working for you, improve your water holding capacity and drainage. It will, okay. Hopefully you're getting most of this. I noticed I had my connection was bleeped out there. So these bullet points are things I've already talked about in terms of the benefits of building soil. So amendments for building soil and maintaining your soil food web include, especially compost is number one, mulch on top. You can use compost teas. I will talk about adding mycorrhizal fungi and these other amendments that oftentimes, for those who, again, this information gets out there on the internet and people are confused and as to whether or not really they provide benefits. So compost itself is just broken down organic material. And it's really high in microbial life if it's done properly, whether you use a composting bin or a composting pile system. Compost will happen. If you just put out piles of organic matter and just let it go, it will just rot down to nothing in in a relatively short time. If you chip it up and mix it up and actually turn it, you can get that process to happen faster so that it becomes like this image here where it's nice and fine. And as that gets mixed into the soil or placed on top of the soil, it's incorporated more quickly, more available to the microbes themselves. And by using, because compost is so high in bacterial and mycorrhizae itself already, it helps add more to your soil and inoculates it. But you need to be very careful that it's not tainted when you add stuff to compost, that it's not tainted with herbicides, pesticides, or fungicides. And you need to even be cautious about using horse manures that have been treated, because oftentimes horses are giving dewormers. You need to really let that compost longer before you put it out into the garden, because you don't want to be applying a dewormer to your garden. I have recommended, because I've been involved in the landscape design and contracting business for 40 years, I learned from the master that I went to work from right out of college to incorporate compost into the soil. He recommended 6 yards per 1,000 square feet. I have doubled that in my own practice. Matter of fact, probably tripled it. I mean, I put on a foot worth of compost, horse manures, worm castings, etc., as I got my garden going this year. And it really shows. And that doesn't go away with time, because you constantly come back on an annual basis and place just a little compost around your plants on a regular basis to kind of keep that process going. But with that incorporation of that much compost, you want to work it in as deeply as you can, either through rototilling or turning, etc., with a fork, and really get that matter down into the soil so that it starts its magic. Animal manures, you need to be careful how you use them, because you really want anything like horse manure, cow, etc., any of that needs to be thoroughly, and chicken manures need to be thoroughly composted before they're used. I like to, with the horse manures, you really can't, I can't process that volume in my bins, but what I ended up doing was using the most composted material I could get my hands on to begin with. Materials that come from, say, llamas and rabbits, you can just put straight on the garden. You don't need to age that. So, but otherwise they need to be aged at least 6 months. Green manures, you can purchase seeds from various suppliers, and green manures, any crop and what you end up doing is let them grow to, say, 6 inches roughly, and then chop and drop and leave them, and they become food for soil organisms, again being brought down into the soil. Oftentimes legumes are used for that. There's a lot of blends out there that include grasses and legumes and other crops, barleys and that really can be used effectively depending on how large your garden is and where you are in the soil building process. They're especially effective for heavy and compacted soils, especially clays and loams, to get them off the ground if you don't want to do the rototill method with organic matter. And there are both spring planting and fall planting mixes. There are irrigated and non-irrigated mixes. Pleasant Valley Supply is one of a good source for going in and at least looking at the variety of manures, green manures available, and cover crops as well. So cover crops are actually, rather than chop and drop, you just let them grow and as a ground cover type material underneath your plants. And so the cover crops are often used to prepare beds for spring vegetable gardens. They're great for using under your fruit trees. They actually, I know that a lot of old orchardists used to just keep everything bare, thinking that any competition with roots of any weeds, it was non-beneficial. And what we know now is that the more diversity of plants that are around your trees, the more soil organisms you have, and the healthier all of those plants will be in concert with each other. So using cover crops can be a very beneficial practice. They actually, besides feeding the soil, they help attract and feed beneficial insects that then help keep the pests down. They manage the other pest insects, and they attract the pollinators as well. And they add the biomass and fix nitrogen. And they also help shade your soil, which then helps keep it more moist and not drying out and stressing your plants. It's best to use organic mulches with the exception of 5 feet within your soil, your structure of your home. Our fire standards are changing all the time, and now the recommendation is to avoid planting any plant material within 5 feet of a structure. So instead of organic mulches right around the house, it's recommended to use layers of, say, cobble or gravel or something on that order. But out in the garden itself, organic mulches are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of enhancing soil health, including wood chips. And I get tons of them from the companies that are around the county reducing trees over the electric lines and that. Leaves and pine needles, and whether you shred them or just leave them whole, either they can be used either way. You want to be careful with some of these organic mulches, especially pine needles. And again, keep them away from your structures and don't let the layers get too terribly thick, 3 to 4 inches. And you want to keep the mulches away from the crown of your trees and other plants so that they don't cause rot problems. Straw can also effectively be used, but you want to be careful with straw that you're not bringing in a lot of new weed seed, and especially invasive grasses. So here's an example of before and after. You know, if you don't use mulches, your soil gets very dried out. It's more prone to weeds, whereas applying that really helps prevent evaporation. It helps your soil stay more evenly moist, provides a better home for beneficial organisms, and it helps reduce compaction in this particular case if that's a pathway around the plants. One of the things I did as a park planner in specifying materials for parks, especially campgrounds, and that is to put mulches on to help reduce the impacts of traffic and walking around. It really does help disperse the pressure and reduces compaction. Now, compost teas are something that we as master gardeners don't teach specifically about because you cannot create the same that again, because you can create that, but they're not the same. But there are benefits to compost tea. So there is information out there on the internet, and I see my connection is unstable again. Okay, so compost teas can, they'll be different from batch to batch. You can find information on the internet on how to use them, create them and use them. It can help get, if you are lacking that soil biology and you want to boost that system, it can be a good way to do that. Landscape fabrics are a huge no-no. They really impact soil health in a deleterious way. They prevent air and now supposedly, yes, the soil water can go through a lot of these fabrics, but it's just not the same in terms of how it goes through the soil with under a layer of mulch as opposed through this stuff. It impedes airflow, it impedes the ability of, and obviously if you put compost on top of this, it's not going to have that contact with the soil and get down in there. So really, I mean, I use this, the one on the bottom, I use this under my walkways because I have gravel walkways, because it's not my soil. It's not where I want to concentrate and plants will eventually, the roots will get there if they want to, but that's about the only thing I see this type of landscape fabric being beneficial to. So don't use it in your beds. Another way to incorporate or to deal with improving your soils through sheet mulching. It's also called often referred to as lasagna gardening. And you can do this and either control weeds or just simply build your soil by layering newspaper, cardboard, straw, compost, etc. And that's a great way to get rid of an old lawn, unless it's Bermuda grass, because it won't be that effective for that. This is a great graphic. This is Toby Hemingway's bomb-proof sheet mulch, a graphic for that. And you can see all the various layers that are involved in this. But you put down a layer like this on top of your soil, and I will guarantee you the following, within 6 months' time, you're going to see a tremendous increase in the amount of organic matter and the soil quality underneath this mulch within a relatively short period of time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the nutrients, some of the nutrients needed that you may want to consider supplementing. And these are not, again, there's been no proof that any of these work. And so I would really caution you about getting sucked into using these kinds of things. The rock powders and biochars. Biochar has been shown to be most effective if you actually incorporate it into your compost, because there are pores inside of a piece of wood that has been biocharred that actually can benefit soil organisms. It gives them a place to hide. It gives more nooks and crannies in the soil. So for a while, you will get some benefit from that, but it's not the biochar itself really doesn't improve the soil. There's just nothing about it. Otherwise, you're better off, again, using compost, something that organisms can get in and digest. The whole thing about biochar is it's supposed to be resistant to decomposition. Is the decomposition that is what's building your soil. So one of the things in terms of improving your yard health, things that you can do on a year-round basis is get your compost piles cooking. You know, I know I've got mine's ongoing year-round, but applying compost to the landscape and garden areas. Everything out in my yard's already starting to push. So this is the time to get your compost, new layer of compost on. Refresh the mulch under your trees and shrubs. Keep a 2 to 4 inch layer of compost, or excuse me, mulch down on top of your soils. Meal has improved, yeah, really microphones. I really apologize. I seem to be going in and out, but anyway, that is another item that you can use. In the summertime, continue composting using some of your leftover materials that are coming from your vegetable garden, and reapply that on a regular basis, and replenish your mulches as needed as well. And in the fall, if green mulch is available, use that in your veggie beds. I'm gathering up and storing leaves. I simply rake or blow my leaves into all of my landscape beds. I do not get rid of them. And the one time I had a landscaper come and help me on some things, he thought he was doing a favor, raking up all my leaves. I had him put them all back. And tried to educate them as to the reason why. And then other things that can, if you really have soils that are just absolutely devoid of organic matter, adding soybean meal and some of these items, the oatmeal, oat bran, etc., can help kind of give that boost. But again, you probably want to really be considered doing that within a layered mulch system so that it will get into the soil, get incorporated by the organisms. Winter time's a great time. This is a great time to be reading good garden articles, whether you do it online or via books. So when you consider the soil food web, that's how Mother Nature does things. No one ever fertilized an old growth forest. So take a look. We're so lucky to live in an area where it's easy to get to natural areas. And you just look around at how, you know, most of the oak trees and most of the plants around us in a more natural area are thriving and doing very well. Yeah, we get our occasional bark beetle infestations, etc. But most of the oaks are doing very well. So by you taking those same principles and applying them, you can benefit as well. So that is the presentation. I'm hoping that we've got some questions, and I don't. Let's see.
Hi, Kit. This is Diane. First of all, I just want to take a moment just to thank you for your presentation. It was absolutely wonderful. I learned so much. So thank you for that. And there are a number of questions here in the chat. So if you don't mind, I'll take a couple of minutes and read them to you.
Sure.
Perhaps you can respond. All righty, the first one from David. Were you looking for natural selection as the process of the evolution of symbiosis from molds with plants?
Could you read it one more time?
Yeah. Were you looking for natural selection as the process of the evolution of symbiosis of molds with plants? And I know David may be still on here. Maybe he can respond.
So let's see if I can read that question.
It's from David.
Natural selection of, in terms of, so David, go ahead, explain a little more what you're looking for.
Yeah, you were searching for a term, that's all. And I just thinking of what you're talking about, the evolution of a relationship of symbiosis would come with natural selection, you know, in terms of evolution. That's just a comment. I think you were looking for a term when you were talking about it.
I'm thinking of coevolution was the term I was looking for. They've co-evolved with each other. Right. So that, yeah. So anyway, these processes didn't just, it's like to have the level of these symbiotic relationships, you know that they had to co-evolve together to attain that. So. Sure.
David, do you want to continue with your other question about commercial mulch?
Yeah, you already talked about mulch. That was a very, the whole thing is great, a great presentation. And you talked about mulch and that was wonderful. My only other question was, it's kind of a out in left field because probably GMO is not that relevant to gardens around here. But I just wondered in terms of genetically modified organisms, how does the soil food web play with GMO plants?
Oh, that would be interesting to know. I can't answer that question. I would, because some of them are engineered with you know, to help them fight off disease or particular pests through using genetic material from totally non-related. You know, it's one thing if they took a chemical from one plant and then splice that in to help another plant is usually mostly used in agriculture. But when you start splicing in something from an animal, I don't know. It would be really interesting to know if those same relationships develop, but I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Really great presentation. Thank you.
It was very good. Another question here. In fact, it was my question. So, and you may have covered this, but I may have missed part of it. So if you have established garden beds where you wouldn't be able to use a rototiller, and you want to improve your soil, do you side dress plants with compost over time? Or I have a lot of property. I have, well, a lot of gardens, 1.5 acres of beds and things. And so I'm wondering, how do I go about improving this clay structure with without rototilling around established plants?
Right. So yes, then the use of compost and especially worm castings have shown. I know a friend of mine who teaches in the Sacramento area. He says, like, if you can afford it, put 2 inches of worm castings, because he's been able to go back to clients' homes and literally, I mean, in a short period of time, those can really help boost that aspect of the soil. But then whatever you put down, put mulch on top of that, because that's an ongoing food source for everything in the soil. So that will help. That will help.
Thank you. One other one, Mychorrhizae. I've seen it in containers where you can purchase it.
Yes.
And I wondered, should I be purchasing that to add to my compost, or?
I would say no. I would say no, because most of it in the first place is probably dead if it's in a package. It's not probably living material. One of the things that Elaine Ingham recommends is going out to an area that's forested. I'm looking out at my neighbor's property, or further down on my own property, and get a trowel full of soil from an area that is well forested, and bring it back and mix it into your compost bin. It will help start growing. And then when you use that compost around your plants, it disperses the mycorrhizae and will let it get, so if you don't think you have it, but I would avoid the store-bought mycorrhizae.
Okay, great.
Just because you really don't know. And I remember at one of the conferences I went to at UC Davis, the professors there thought, you're just buying dead material for the most part. So, and they actually did test some of it. So, and it wasn't living.
Oh, great. Well, that's the end of the questions we have in the chat. I'm going to open this up to folks that are online if they have any questions, if they would just simply open their microphone and let us know. Do we have any other questions out there?
No? Okay.
I guess not.
Great. Well, we have, also Master Gardeners has a Facebook feed in terms of a Facebook page that is a great place to keep up. It's regularly, it's updated with articles about gardening. And there is a list of ongoing classes that we offer. So please keep up with that.
There's some great videos there.
And now, yeah, especially with COVID, and as we do these classes are being archived on YouTube. So if you search El Dorado County Master Gardeners on YouTube, you'll find a whole array of wonderful videos. And then also, I believe it's Central Sierra Master Gardeners, because that's, we are sisters with Tuolumne, and I'm trying to remember the other, Amador County. Mm-hmm. So those 2 sites alone, you'll find more information in what they're doing as well.
Do you have any idea when this video will be posted, Kit?
I imagine tomorrow or even today.
Oh, okay.
I would have to ask Tracy, but I see she had to leave.
Yeah. Okay, so, great. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been a fantastic session. I really appreciate it. We hope you come back and join us again. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Say goodbye, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye. Have a great
day.
Thank you. Everybody.
Bye, Kit. Thank you. Well,
thank you.
Applause, applause, applause.